When we talk about growing a business, we love to focus on the exciting things: more customers, more revenue, new markets, new opportunities, maybe even a bigger office. But growth also brings something else that we have to think about: risk. And as our businesses grow, the way we manage that risk has to grow with us. As we all know, independent contractor drivers are an important part of the final mile industry. They give businesses the flexibility to scale while giving people the choice to work independently. But as that contractor network also grows, the processes, documentation, and compliance practices supporting it have to keep pace. Because on paper, a contractor model can look great, the agreements are signed, the policies are in place, the boxes are checked. But what happens when someone looks beyond the paperwork? Can you demonstrate that the way you actually operate supports what's on paper? Well, that's what we'll be talking about today. And with that, hello everyone, and welcome to CLDA's Final Mile Fridays. If you're a longtime CLDA member, welcome back. And if you're discovering us for the very first time, we're so glad that you're spending your Friday with us. I'm Lorena Camargo, president of the CLDA, the Customized Logistics and Delivery Association, and I am your host for this series. At CLDA, we're all about bringing together the people, ideas, and conversations that move our industry forward. And Final Mile Fridays is one more way that we're doing that. Each week, we sit down with industry leaders and experts to talk about the issues that matter to final mile businesses. Our goal is to keep these conversations practical, relevant, and useful so you walk away with something that you can take back to your business. So, even though it's exciting to talk about revenue and that type of growth, we're also going to be talking about the systems that we have to put in place in order to achieve that growth. So, with that, we're going to be talking about independent contractor compliance and risk. The regulatory environment continues to evolve, and for carriers, that creates an important challenge. How do you continue to grow, operate efficiently, and make sure your compliance practices are keeping up with your business? So, to help us unpack that, I'm so excited to welcome Wendy Greenland, CEO of Openforce. Wendy has spent years working alongside carriers across the country, helping companies build stronger and more scalable independent contractor programs. Wendy, thank you for being here and thank you for your continued partnership with CLDA and our industry.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm so excited about this podcast, what you're doing, Lorena. Just very excited to be here and appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Now, before
Have
we get
to.
into today's topic, I'd love for our audience to get to know you a little better. I know I've had the privilege of knowing you for a few years, but just for our audience that may not know you, could you just tell us a little bit more about how you got into this industry and what led you to Open Force?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my career in telecommunications. So early on at Sprint and working in early CDMA technology for mobile devices before smartphones were even invented. And as I grew in the telecommunications industry and started my own business for 12 years, I worked in telecommunications. And my focus was on improving communications and making a better experience for everyone involved. And as I sold the shares of my business in 2012, I needed to find something new, and I decided to move over to the software side of technology. And I started looking around, and I felt really strongly that the HRIS side, which is human capital management, kind of how workers are captured within the software world. And that became my focus for the next several years. I worked for a company called Infinity HR. It was a benefits admin system for an HRIS, but also a payroll integrator. And in 2018, they sold to private equity, and I started trying to decide, okay, so I have this opportunity to either move to this new organization and participate in helping that grow and get to where it is today. It's now called Arcoro. They're a construction HCM. But I decided that I started having conversations with Openforce, and it was the 1099 side of the business. And I knew that during my time at in HRIS and payroll companies that there were a lot of companies that were doing this wrong. And so as I looked at Openforce and what Openforce, the problem it was solving was very exciting to me, because I knew there's this whole side of the workforce that was fast growing, but a lot of people were struggling with how to handle it properly. And Openforce seemed to have cracked the code. They knew all the different legislative and legal landscape issues. They understood the balance between risk and efficiency, and that was an exciting opportunity for me. So as I came on to Openforce, I was COO at the time, and then within a year tapped to be CEO. I realized very quickly that it was highly transportation specific, and partly that was because misclassification was growing in transportation early, and in courier and last mile, as we know, it's certainly something that we've seen often. And so understanding what it means for the transportation industry became my first few years here, just understanding all of the implications and the complexities around bringing on drivers that are compliant, but also have the right insurances, and doing it in a way that mitigates risk really was an exciting challenge for me. And I was happy to jump in and tackle that challenge.
Okay, great. So that background really gives you an interesting perspective, because in the last couple years, actually, that's an understatement. I feel like every year there's new legislation that really affects the way that we work with independent contractors. But let me get your opinion. What has changed around independent contractor compliance over the last few years? And why should final mile carriers be paying attention to it right now?
Well, so there are a few tailwinds going on in the industry right now. 1099s are growing. People want independent work. I think certainly the pandemic pushed a lot of people into independent contractor work because they had to, for a number of reasons. We know as an industry that we grew exponentially for a period of time there. It was kind of crazy. We could not get enough drivers. But 1099 work grew in many industries. And so obviously when you have that kind of growth, you've got a lot of people trying to figure out how to solve problems in the space. And along with that kind of growth, we've seen a growth in people doing it wrong. And so when people come into the space and they're trying to do it, and they're really prioritizing efficiency, and they don't really care about risk, they're just trying to get people on the road, and they're not doing it right, they don't understand. But they're trying to do it fast because we need to get drivers on the road quicker, sooner, faster. We saw an increase in litigation, an increase in claims, and increase in lawsuits. And we saw some of the more risky states adding different laws that also made it more and more difficult to classify a worker as an independent contractor. Like in the state of California, it was around the time when AB 5 was codified. And so the ABC test became the classification test in California. Other states are following suit and looking at that as something they want to do. And as a result, many companies are left trying to figure out how to run a business successfully, where they need to use independent contract workers because the work is intermittent, and they're trying to figure out how to do it successfully without risking their business. But at the same time, they've got to get workers out, and they've got to get them out as quickly as they can. And so we found that over the last few years in particular, there's been a rise in independent work, and with it, a rise in misclassification lawsuits. In addition, I think there's been a rise in auto liability cases, auto liability claims. And when auto liability gets kind of tied to the misclassification landscape, it becomes more and more risky, because if a driver is, especially if it's a master sub relationship and there's a subcontractor and they get into an auto liability situation, who's liable? And so obviously there's been at the Supreme Court, there's been cases, landmark cases that are changing the way everyone's thinking about this. But at the end of the day, there's a few things that people need to be concerned about, and that is who is controlling the work of that worker. And if it's the transportation company, if it's the courier company, if it's the last mile company, and you cannot prove that you do not control what they do, then you're going to be in trouble. And if there's an auto liability case on top of it, then it even complicates it further. And when somebody's seriously injured, that's when judgments get larger and larger, and jury verdicts become more and more nuclear. And we're seeing that kind of all over the nation right now.
Yep. And thank you for mentioning California, because there are certain states where it is a lot more challenging to work with independent contractors. So as a carrier is growing, right? They're operating in multiple states. How much more complicated does that become when requirements can vary from one district to another?
Yeah, so it can be very complicated. So it's important that in the world that we're in, that you really have to understand the business that you're doing in the states, and not just the states, but even the municipalities you're in. In some cases, the municipality is just as important as the state itself. So in Seattle, for example, you have to understand the specific local laws that you have to meet, not just the state of Washington. And so as you are growing as a business, complexity with misclassification also begins to grow. You have to understand what the requirements are to classify a worker, whether it's in the state, whether it's in the municipality, whether it's in the state, and how to comply with a multi-factor test at the federal level. And so thinking about all of those pieces and parts become a very difficult way to manage a business. So partnering with companies like ours to help you kind of think through all of the ramifications, depending on the state, depending on the location you're in, and the requirements for the different locations. I think that all adds to the complexity of the work that we do. These are difficult problems to solve, but they are solvable. Once we kind of understand the laws of the different areas, whether it's a city or state law or regulation that we have to meet, then you can begin to capture proof that you're doing those things, depending on the location that you're in. And I think it comes down to proof. Can you prove the relationship that you're creating by location, by city, by state, and federally?
Mhm. And this is actually an area where CLDA helps our members stay informed. As you all know, advocacy is a core pillar at CLDA. And if you've been to our website, you should check out the legislation tracker. We actually have something there where you can follow state and federal legislation that we're monitoring that could impact your business. So if you're a CLDA member watching, that's a resource that you should be checking out. We're going to drop the link in the comments. I did get a question from Mark Chisano, Wendy. He's based in New York. He says, ask Wendy about her thoughts on Intro 518 in New York City, also known as the Delivery Protection Act.
Well, so New York City has a lot going on right now, Mark, as you know. I'm following closely, and just backing up for a second, Lorena, I want to really commend the CLDA and Mark in particular, and some of those that are on the Government Affairs Committee, because the CLDA is actively participating in lobby efforts to try and really advocate for the courier and the last mile industry. And I really appreciate over the years the fact that CLDA has not been afraid to step up. They ask us often to help participate in writing letters and different things that we can do in the industry to get the word out. And I know in New York, for example, there's legislation that would inhibit the size of warehouses, and it would almost make it impossible in New York for a company to have independent contract workers. And the work that the Government Affairs Committee at the CLDA has been doing to not only try and help lobby, but also get the word out to all of us about what's going on there has been, I think, tremendous. And I think because of the work that the CLDA has done, along with many other partners I know in the industry that have been trying to help with this, they have been they've been backing off a little bit on the initial strength they had in this bill they're trying to put forth. And so we have a little bit of time, but that doesn't mean that other states aren't following suit. Like Illinois, I think, could also start looking at something similar. But at the end of the day, what they're trying to do is make it so that companies like Amazon have a much more difficult time to have independent contractors in the state of New York. The problem is that the independent workforce wants to be independent, and what they don't realize, and I think through the hearings that they were doing, I think they found that there are a lot of independent workers that want to remain independent in the state of New York. And so what legislators, I think, have to really begin to consider as they're listening to all of this is, yes, there are bad actors out there trying to push people beyond their limits and call them independent workers. And that's not good for any of us. We don't want that for our workers. We know that the independent contractors are out there trying to do a good job every day, and they're the ones that keep this country moving. But those that want to be independent and want to do this work because it's good for their families and it's good for their livelihood, and they like owning a business and they like being able to grow that business and bring on subcontractors, what about them? And I think what I heard in many of those hearings was that there are a lot of independent workers that are saying, no, don't take this away from us. Let's just work together to find a path forward that allows us to have a successful relationship on both sides of this ecosystem. Contracting companies need workers that are intermittent, that aren't always on dispatch, that can do other things when they don't need them, but when they need them, they want to engage them. And then there are independent workers that want to be able to be independent. They want higher earning potential. They want flexible work schedules. They want to be able to go to the soccer game at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and maybe do some work at night. So there are independent workers that want to be independent. How do we make this work? And I think New York kind of took a step back and said, let's see how we can better think about this so that we're not eliminating viable business opportunities for workers. And we'll see where it goes. I don't know where it's going to go. And if I had a crystal ball, I would tell you, but I don't. But I do think that many workers stood up and said, hey, hold on, this isn't the right answer necessarily. Let us continue to be independent. Let's find another way. And that's part of the reason I love Openforce so much, is because tell us what the regulations are. Tell us what the legislation is. Let's let independent workers be independent if they choose to be. And then let's create a technology that provides the proof of the relationship. And so that's the work that I enjoy doing every day.
Right. Yes. And so let's connect that back to growth, because when we talk about technology, everyone automatically thinks our dispatching software, which obviously is key. But also because many of us started with just a van, a phone, and a dream, we've grown our businesses. Sometimes the processes that worked when it was just a few of us doesn't work as we continue growing. Many CLDA members are in that 10 million and under range. They don't have an internal legal department or a large compliance team. So as you watch carriers grow, where do you typically see their contractor programs becoming the most vulnerable?
We talked to hundreds of companies and hundreds of thousands of independent contract workers. And what we find is that most of the time we have good people trying to do a good thing. And we have many companies with admins every day that wake up and are trying to do right by the company and by the independent contract workers they're working with. We have companies that have created pretty good independent contractor models, even smaller companies sometimes. But what we find is that when you get busy and as you begin to grow and scale, the best intentions sometimes get thrown out the window. And what happens is that people are tired, people are busy, and the record keeping and the things that need to happen every day in order to mitigate the risk of misclassification, the proof that you have to have, goes by the wayside, because you got to get the driver on the road as quickly as possible. And so decisions get made in the moment sometimes that come back to haunt small companies. And I think that's probably what I see most often, is that companies were caught doing something they knew they shouldn't have done, but in the moment they did it because they had to get someone to get that delivery out. And we all understand the pressure to do that. And it's trying to get the delivery to the person who's asking for it within a reasonable amount of time. It's all good intentions, but what happens is that things get missed, documents get missed, acknowledgments and records are missing, and they're not in the right places, or somebody's handwriting something on a contract, sign here, do this. And those become then proof points against the company on behalf of a worker for misclassification. And that's when things start to get dicey, because once that happens, then they start talking to friends and neighbors, and it becomes class action. And now you've got a pretty significant settlement that you might be looking at in order to fix things and get them turned around. So providing the proof is the most important thing you can be thinking about every day in order to run an effective independent contractor program. And I think that putting time and energy into a technology that can create proof points. So when people are tired, and the technology is doing the work, and it's capturing the things that you need so that it's there when you need it. And I think those are some of the things that really help, especially smaller companies, as they're beginning to see, oh my gosh, I have an opportunity here. I can grow this business. I can make some money. I can put some money away for my kids. As that begins to happen, well, that's when you're at the most risk. Things begin to grow, and sometimes it's the compliance items and the insurance that's missing. Those types of things begin to get a little out of hand, and that's where we come in.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. Now we do have a comment from Ralph. Ralph, thanks for joining us. He says much of the discussion around protecting the independent contractor model focuses on carriers and drivers. Can you explain why preserving a healthy, compliant independent contractor model is equally important to affiliate members, shippers, and ultimately the customers who rely on time-critical logistics?
Yeah, so that's Ralph, that's such a great question. This ecosystem, it goes beyond the contracting company and the independent contractor, and that's exactly what Ralph's saying. So it's when you think about an independent contract driver, and in the case of the CLDA, right, we're talking about these drivers, these workers that are out doing the work every day. You've got compliance, you've got insurance, and you've got payments, the things that are in their world every single day. And in the middle of that, you have this data that they have that everybody in the ecosystem needs to understand and needs at specific times. So insurance companies, for example, are a great part of the ecosystem that require information and data from the independent contractor and the contracting company sometimes, in order to be able to know when there's a claim, whether or not they were on or off dispatch. And so there's this information that's needed for a carrier. The broker is actually they're out there selling these policies, and they need to know if they're on dispatch. So here's data, right? So you've got this data that insurance companies and brokers need. And then you've got compliance. You've got when there's an auto liability case, again, you're coming back to insurance, but you've also got other people in the ecosystem that are going to need information when there's an accident, or if there's loss in cargo and other things. So you've got other players. In addition, you've got the customer that's just waiting on their delivery. And then you've got the shippers, right? And so you've got all of these players in the ecosystem that rely on this relationship, and they rely on a holistic relationship that is effective and that is put together in a way that mitigates the risk for everyone. And I'll give you a few examples. If there is a master contractor that brings on a subcontractor, and that subcontractor doesn't have compliance items or insurance, and they go and they're doing a delivery, and that delivery to someone's home doesn't get there on time, the person disappears with the product. You've got cargo issues. You've got a shipper saying, hey, why hasn't this been delivered? You've got a customer waiting. You've got all sorts of issues in the supply chain that become problematic if that master contractor doesn't have a relationship with that subcontractor that is meaningful, that where they have a background check, a drug screen, a motor vehicle record, they have the right insurances. So it all becomes meaningful between the contracting company and a master contractor, that IC initially. And then when the IC starts to get bigger as they bring on subcontractors, you can see that the ecosystem becomes more and more complex. So as you have complexity, you have people out potentially doing deliveries that are not compliant. And when that happens, that's when risk really begins to grow exponentially. Do you really want someone in your home delivering a mattress to somebody who's living alone, or an elderly person living alone in their bedroom with somebody who doesn't have a background check, a valid background check, and maybe didn't pass a drug screen, right? And so they're in the home, they have a history of criminal activity, and we don't know because we didn't do the compliance, and it just begins to get more and more complex around the ecosystem. So that affects the homeowner that's trying to get that mattress delivered, or whatever it is they're getting delivered. It affects the shipper because the shipper thought this product was getting from one place to the other. And it all comes down to that relationship. It comes down to the compliance and making sure that the right compliance items are collected, you have the proof, and that you have the right insurances, and that they're in place at the right time.
All right. So when we think of like proof points, obviously insurance super important. You shared a couple other proof points that a company should be collecting, because as someone that lives in California, like, yeah, insurance check, right? But I'm always terrified of a misclassification lawsuit from the DOL. So
Yeah.
could you tell us a little more about other proof points? I know you mentioned a couple during our prep call.
Yeah. So, as we're having conversations with early in a new relationship with a contracting company, and we look at the locations they're going to be bringing on workers. And by the way, while we work primarily with courier, last mile, trucking, we also do a lot of work with other types of workforces like call centers and massage therapists and dog sitters, and anywhere there's complexities around compliance and insurance, we're interested, because we know that we have the technology to solve those problems. So we've grown beyond what we do in courier, but courier really is where there's a lot of complexity with regards to compliance and insurance, right? So when you're in different states and different locations, and you have to meet different classification tests, so take California, you have to meet the ABC test. Nobody out there is going to be able to tell you that they have a silver bullet for all three, for the A, the B, and the C prong. But what you can do is you can create proof points through workflows that capture information that prove that this is an independent worker, that they have their own tools of the trade, and that they are doing business with other entities. For example, with some of our companies, not all of our companies in California do this, but for some of our companies in California, in the workflow, they'll capture things like their web address for their business, their business cards. They will ask for other companies that they're doing business with, and capture that information so that it's in the technology should they ever need it, to show that they're doing business with other companies. They also encourage them to sign up on our Connect platform, where they can basically hang up a shingle and say, hey, I can deliver in this area. And so by the fact that those independent contractors are entering their information, getting set up in our Connect platform, that shows that they're actually marketing their business. And then when they're selecting things on our marketplace that are for their business purposes, any business tool they select on our marketplace, it just shows that they are that they're using their funds for business profit and loss, and making decisions on their business outside of the relationship with the contracting company in those states. So part of it depends on location. Part of it depends on how solid you want this this tank driving down the road. Do you want a tank? Do you want to make sure it's bulletproof? I'd add all of that stuff to the workflow. Every single question I would add to the workflow. But then you have to balance that against efficiency, right? It does take them longer to get through a workflow like that. So it's constantly a balance between risk versus efficiency. You know, do we have to have all of these pieces, or can't we have parts of these, and what are we collecting? And that's usually the conversation that we have as people are onboarding or thinking about adding locations, to make sure that they're thinking about all of those pieces.
Okay, great. Now, I can't believe we're at time, and that's on you because you're a wealth of knowledge. I could talk to you all day. One of my favorite things about this conversation is when people think like advocacy and like government affairs, it's just like, all right, that's politics. But I love how you tied it with like, this impacts our business operationally. There's legislation out there that there's good intentions, but unfortunately sometimes gets in the way of how we operate.
Yeah.
So I love that Openforce has a risk assessment on their website. We're gonna drop the link in the comments so that you guys could check it out. I do want to close this segment though with you mentioned a lot of things. But if someone were to like, end this segment, go back to their leadership team, like um what advice would you have like in regards to taking a closer look at their contractor program? What's like the first thing that they should focus on?
I would do an audit. It, talked many years ago with a very close friend of mine that you all know well. They had a wonderful independent contractor model they set up. It was like bulletproof. They were so excited. Like they knew all the things and they did all the things, and they had this beautiful program set up. But then a year later went in and just like did an audit, just picked a couple of ICs and walked through, made sure they had all the documentation that they knew they had. And half of the documentation was missing. It was just all over the place. People were writing on contracts, and it was just as risky as it was before they put the model in place. And it wasn't because the model wasn't strong, it was because of the way it was being executed. And so I think picking a few ICs and walking through and make sure you have all of the documentation, and imagine you're being audited by the DOL or by your state agencies, any of those state agencies, depending on the location. See if you have everything, all the proof that you need. And if you don't, then you probably need to do an audit like what we have here, you see on the screen. But you can do that with us. We can help you with that if you want a little additional help. But you can just start today by pulling some ICs and walking through, just seeing what you have, and then you might know if you have a problem. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what you think you've set up. What matters is whether you can prove the relationship at the time that you need to prove it and in the way that you need to prove it. And so those would be probably the first steps I would take.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Wendy, and thank you for sharing your expertise with the CLDA community. So, the biggest takeaway for me is that compliance isn't something you just put in place and check off the box. If anything, that's something that as you grow, you keep checking, because we all want to grow, but we want to make sure that we're protecting our business, because it's not just about growing, it's also about building sustainable growth.
Absolutely.
So, with that, we're really gonna this month continue with that theme of growth and risk. Next week's segment, we're gonna be joined by Brian Jungenberg with Brown and Brown, formerly known as Risk Strategies. We're gonna be talking more about insurance and why many of the things insurance companies want to see are also the things that our customers want to see. So it'll be a great conversation about safety, technology, hiring practices, contracts, emerging risks, and a lot of other fun stuff, because owning a final mile business, it's not just about doing deliveries, it's about all these other things, but we love what we do, right?
Right. Absolutely.
So with that, once again, thank you so much for joining CLDA's Final Mile Fridays. If you heard anything here that you like, please post in the comments, like, share. We thank you for your support. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next Friday. Until then, keep moving the final mile forward.